Last time we concluded our study of Luke after covering the first part of Luke's account of the Olivet prophecy in chapter 21. We ended last time with verse 19, which parallels, as we saw then, Matthew 24, verse 13, the admonition to endure to the end. Those who endure to the end will be saved. Today we're ready to continue on in that prophecy. Before we get into verse 20, though, we need to at least be reminded that both Luke and Mark omit a key prophetic revelation that Matthew records Jesus giving concerning the fulfillment of a very critical event that must precede the coming of the end of the age. That's in Matthew 24:14, which says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come." For some reason, neither Luke nor Mark included this, but Matthew does. Now, the completion of this testimony, as we've covered many times before, will be fulfilled in two separate stages. First of all, by the testimony of the two witnesses, beginning 3.5 days prior to Jerusalem being conquered by the beast, and ending then 3.5 days before the sounding of the seventh trump, the time of the first resurrection. In fact, let's go back to Revelation chapter 11. Take note of this. It's very important regarding the sign which was requested by the apostles on the Mount of Olives. Here in Revelation chapter 11, beginning in verse 3, here God says, "And I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands standing before the God of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. These have power to shut heaven, so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy. And they have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. When they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit, or the abyss, will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them." And so these are, as it says here, the two lampstands, the two olive trees, which the only place we can find anything about them is back in the book of Zechariah. So finally, we're told what they represent, though hundreds of years had elapsed. So, the first stage, the two witnesses, a 3.5-year proclamation of the gospel as a testimony before God brings the curtain down on this age. The second part of fulfilling Matthew 24:14 is by the angel that will preach the gospel during the interval between the time that the seventh trumpet is sounded and the coming of the Messiah from heaven, followed by all of the saints. That is back here in chapter 14 of Revelation. Revelation 14 and verse 6. And again, at this point in time, in the flow of the story, the seventh trump has already sounded. "Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, 'Fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and springs of water.'" And so when Jesus said back in Matthew 24:14 that the gospel of the kingdom must be preached in the world, that's a prophecy. And he's talking about these two events, because these are critical events, as the book of Revelation shows. Anything else, subservient. Now, it will be at the coming of Jesus Christ and his saints to destroy the beast, false prophet, and the armies that will be assembled to resist him in the valley of Jezreel, or as we know, the plain of Megiddo, followed by the binding of Satan for 1,000 years that It's not till those things happen that the age finally comes to a close. Those are the final things to be done. Now we come to chapter 21 of Luke, verse 20. Luke 21, verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. This verse directly parallels Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, and Mark chapter 13, verse 14. While those accounts refer to seeing the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, or Mark has, where it ought not stand, without elaborating on what the abomination will be. Neither Matthew nor Mark tell us what that abomination is. However, Luke identifies the abomination as armies that will surround Jerusalem before attacking and bringing destruction to the city. It's an abomination that brings desolation. That's an army. However, Luke leaves out what Matthew and Mark included about Jesus connecting the abomination to critical background that was recorded by Daniel the prophet. Jesus made it clear that in order to understand the key events connected to the beginning of the end of the age, his disciples they must study what Daniel was inspired to record. That's how you discover what the abomination is. What happened historically. Through the angel Gabriel, the archangel Gabriel, God inspired the prophet Daniel to record the information that's critical to this understanding, the information about the final fulfillment of the king of the north, who is designated as the beast by John in Revelation, and of course is also called the Antichrist. We have designated that title at any rate. When he will enter, the king of the north, the beast, will enter the land of Israel at the time of the end, subjugating all of the territory west of the Jordan River. Now, Daniel tells us about that. Back in Daniel 11, let's go back and note this. Daniel 11, verse 40. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, that is the king of the north, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, that is the land of Israel. And many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. Throughout the previous part of the 11th chapter of Daniel, the king of the south, that term, that title that's given here, referred to the Ptolemaic leaders who had power over Egypt and over Ethiopia during that period of time. And the king of the north, prior to this, referred at first to the Seleucid rulers. Again, remember Ptolemy and Seleucus were generals of Alexander the Great, who after his demise, after he died, took over certain parts of the territory, along with two other generals. But after the Seleucid leaders were gone, we have the second part belonging to the leaders of the Roman Empire. Leaders that were associated with the Roman Empire were the next kings of the north. Of course, that would also include all of the revivals. King of the north was always a revival, part of a revival of the Roman Empire. Verse 40 here of Daniel 11 accurately describes how Menelik, the emperor of Ethiopia, would declare war on the army of the kingdom of Italy back in 1895. Considerable amount of time ago, yes. And also the fact that Menelik would defeat the army of the kingdom of Italy. Since then, more of those detailed prophecies leading up to the time of the end have been fulfilled. 40 years after 1895 brings us to 1935. At the beginning of the final revival, if you will, not the final revival, but the final decade of the sixth revival of the Roman Empire, which began at the time that the great General Garibaldi was able to bring all of the small parts of Italy together to form the Kingdom of Italy. And it then became basically an empire. Mussolini attacked Ethiopia in 1935 with an army of more than 100,000 troops. Allied with Hitler's armies, again, remember we had the Desert Fox. We had Rommel with all of his tanks and joining up and assisting. And so they're moving across North Africa. And what we find is most of North Africa was subjugated. But the king of the north, because of Montgomery Patton, was prevented from ever getting to the glorious land. Never got there. Was stopped short. He was prevented. So it seems, therefore, that there will be no further need for another king of the south. It's gotten so far, now we're waiting for a response. The king of the north that rises in the final resurrection of the Roman Empire could fulfill verses 41 through 43 of this prophecy without being provoked, without any provocation. Some people don't understand, well, why not? Why shouldn't there be another king of the south? Well, again, remember, God at times gives us prophecy that looks like it's a continuation, but there's a break, like the 70 weeks prophecy back in Daniel. We also have what Jesus did with Isaiah 61, as it is in our Bibles, where he read so far and stopped and said, today this has been fulfilled in your ears. But he doesn't go on, because right there is a break between what happened at his first coming and what would happen at the second. So we got 2,000 years in between. So not always is every prophecy, when we look at this, you don't have to have another king of the south. Can't see any possibility of a king of the south today. And we've got to be closer to the end than to have another king of the south. Anyway, once Satan is cast down, and we know that from Revelation 12, verse 9, he will possess the man who becomes, first of all, the false prophet. And then he will possess the man who we have described by John as the beast, who is the Antichrist and the king of the north that Daniel writes about. In order to deceive the world into believing that he's the Messiah, he will need to attempt to fulfill key messianic prophecies, many of which focus on the Messiah's future rule from Jerusalem. Therefore, he will enter the glorious land, as Daniel says here. Note in verse 45, Daniel 11:45, and he, the king of the north, shall plant the tents of his palace. This is where he's going to reside, at his palace, between the seas, the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea, and the glorious holy mountain. All right, so we find that he's going to come to Jerusalem. God's purpose in allowing this to happen is to use the king of the north to punish the Jews living in the modern state of Israel. Those who claim the name Israel, which means prevailer with God, but who, because of their disobedience to his laws, do not correctly represent him and have become, as a result, blasphemers of his name. That's what God tells us here in Isaiah chapter 10. Isaiah 10, verse 5. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hand is my indignation. I will send him against an ungodly, or the King James has, a hypocritical nation. Hypocritical. Says one thing, does something else. and against the people of my wrath. I will give him charge to seize the spoil, to take the prey, to tread them down like the mire of the streets. Down in verse 12. Therefore it shall come to pass, when the Lord has performed all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem. And that's at the end time. Again, when it talks about Assyria in Bible prophecy for the end time, it's talking about the beast. Because we have a very, we'll see that in a few minutes. We have a place in the prophecy that shows that Assyria will represent Babylon. All right, when the Lord has performed his work on Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria, or the beast, and the glory of his haughty looks. For he says, by the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I am prudent. Also I have removed the boundaries of the people, and have robbed their treasuries. So I have put down the inhabitants like a valiant man, or like a mighty conqueror. My hand has found like a nest the riches of the people, and as one gathers eggs that are left, I have gathered all the earth, and there was no one who moved his wing nor opened his mouth with even a peep. So Daniel clearly identifies this individual that Isaiah writes about as the beast in Daniel chapter 8. Again, Jesus said, what the prophet Daniel, he who reads, let him understand. The prophet Daniel. Here in Daniel 8:23, the Revised English Bible writes concerning the same individual from Isaiah 10, in the last days of those kingdoms, the kingdoms that Daniel shows with the beast coming up out of the seas, when their sin is at its height, and I would say if sin gets much worse, I can't imagine how it can. A king of grim aspect, or bold countenance, or Moffat has, one who is defiant will appear, a master of stratagem or intrigue. He, verse 24 goes on in the New International, he will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men. Or, Revised English Bible, he will work havoc on the mighty nations and the holy people. Now, how is it that he became very strong but not by his own power? The beast will be possessed by Satan the devil. That's part of it. But he will also receive physical power and authority from 10 rulers who support him, according to what John records back in Revelation chapter 17. Going on here in Daniel 8:25, Revised English Bible, by cunning and deceit he will succeed in his designs. He will devise great schemes and wreak havoc on many when they least expect it. It's going to come unexpectedly. That's what Jesus tells us. Like a thief in the night, it's going to happen. When this happens, it's going to be amazing. He will challenge even the Prince of Princes and be broken or be destroyed, as other translations have, but by no human hand. That describes what goes on in Revelation chapter 19 when Jesus takes him and casts him and the false prophet into a lake of fire. Now, initially, this kingdom of the north, this beast, will be in an alliance with many of the Islamic nations. Notice back in Psalm 83. Psalm 83. Verse 1. Psalm 83, verse 1. Do not keep silent, O God. Do not hold your peace, and do not be still, O God. For behold, your enemies make a tumult, or your enemies rage, Tanakh translates. Your enemies rage, and those who hate you have lifted up their head, or they have exalted themselves, the New American Standard has. They have taken crafty counsel against your people, and have consulted together against your sheltered or your treasured ones. They have said, come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. For they have consulted together with one consent. They form a confederacy or an alliance, other translations have, against you, By going against Israel, they go against you. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagarites, Gebal, Ammon, Amalek, Philistia, and the inhabitants of Tyre. Assyria has also joined them. They have helped the children of Lot, Selah. Again, Assyria here is a reference to Babylon the Great in end-time prophecy. This psalm is positioned in the third book of the Psalms, which is primarily prophetic material concerning events leading up to the day of the Lord. Prophetically, by comparing Daniel chapter 4, which talks about Nebuchadnezzar being, and the Babylonian Empire being like this giant tree that spreads over and whatever nations come under it. And we go to Ezekiel chapter 31, where we have Assyria like this giant tree. They're the same thing. So they're interchangeable. And so whatever is said about Assyria in end-time prophecy is really talking about Babylon the Great. Now, the 9 peoples listed here in Psalm 83 that will be allied with the beast power, with Babylon the Great, are either direct descendants of Esau, peoples who have intermarried with Esau, or those who have simply felt it best to yield to Esau's influence. And again, we don't need to go through anything on the Mideast today. We all know that most of the troublemakers there are descendants of Esau. They're tied in to Esau, just as the Bible, book of Obadiah shows in other places. According to what God inspired Daniel to record, prior to the coming of the king of the north, animal sacrifices will be restored in Jerusalem. That's the reason you got to study Daniel. You got to know what Daniel says. There are things that he shows there that are going to happen at the end time. Now, God's word does not seem to indicate directly what prompts their restoration. Perhaps based on a prophecy in Isaiah chapter 9 about Ephraim and Manasseh against Judah, possibly that prophecy, maybe perhaps the state of Israel will be deserted completely by the United States and the UK or the Commonwealth nations. Maybe that's what brings it about. And then other nations will, there are several, Brazil and Honduras and Guatemala or whatever, they've made promises to move their embassies to Jerusalem and do certain things, but they're not powerhouses by any means to do anything. But all of those, if they're deserted, especially by the U.S., which, will the present president be reelected? Or where are we in prophecy? Because if one of these weirdos who seem to be completely from an insane asylum, including the governor of this state, if they get in, you better believe that the embassy that now sits in Jerusalem will no longer be in Jerusalem. They'll rip that thing out of there and probably give all the money to Iran or whatever. Anyway, we're in such a crazy world. It's hard to sometimes to even know what's going on. At any rate, whatever happens to Israel, something is going to leave Israel no other alternative than eventually to turn to the only place left. Instead of turning there first, we'll go to God last, okay? And so they'll finally be required to do that. Now, possibly it will be the appearance of the false prophet who comes calling fire down from heaven, and the Jews will bring the Jews to the point to believe that Elijah has finally come, and they need to begin sacrifices. They know that the Messiah is about to appear. They're talking now. There are all kinds of them that are talking Messiah is going to appear this year. These are things that you find when you read among the religious and ultra-religious factions over in the state of Israel. Whatever the reason and the circumstances turn out to be, Daniel recorded two separate lengths of days back in Daniel chapter 12. So let's go back a few pages here to Daniel 12. These lengths of days seem to culminate on the same day, which would be the day that the seventh trumpet is blown, thereby revealing the day, the very day when the sacrifices will begin. This day can be derived by subtracting the length of days from one from the other, which leads to the conclusion that the sacrifices would start 45 days prior to their being stopped by the king of the north or by the beast. Daniel's account, and no other place can you find it in the Bible than Daniel's account. Daniel's account also conclusively reveals that the sacrifices will be stopped at the beginning of the 1290 days before the seventh trumpet is blown. Stopped on the very day that Jerusalem is surrounded by the armies of the beast. Note here in verse 11 of Daniel 12. And from the time that the daily sacrifice, or the continual burnt offering, as it's actually talking about here, is taken away, that it's to be taken away, it's got to be there. It has to be there to be taken away. From the time it's taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, that's the armies of the beast moving in around Jerusalem, there shall be 1,290 days. Daniel was finally told that the total countdown of 1,335 days would end with a blessing for those who endure to the end, whether they are among those who are asleep as the dead in Christ, or those who are still alive and remain, like Paul says back in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. But here in verse 12, I'll read from the New International Translation, "Blessed is the one who waits for, who endures, and reaches the end of the 1,335 days." So, those who are not familiar with the material that God inspired the prophet Daniel to record will not have the understanding necessary to connect its significance to the instructions that Jesus gives next as we go on through here in Luke chapter 21. So Luke 21 again, verse 21. Then let those who are in Judea, once the army of the beast moves in, now that we know what Daniel tells us to expect, we then come back to verse 21. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, the reason Jesus specified that only those in Judea are to flee to the mountains when Jerusalem is being surrounded by armies is because that is where his disciples are to have previously assembled after becoming aware of the beginning of animal sacrifices in Jerusalem. The prophetic details of that assembly were covered by Luke earlier back in chapter 17, round about verse 37 or 38. Luke's already addressed that. We're going to find that Matthew and Mark, also will address it in a different spot, just to let you know. Now, since the beast will have come to Jerusalem from the north, these mountains, when it says flee to the mountains, would be to the east and or to the south of Jerusalem, based on the prophecy that the area on the east side of the Jordan River will not be conquered by the beast when the beast moves in, as we covered in chapter 11 of Daniel a little bit ago. It would be logical to conclude that those mountains, or these mountains that are mentioned here in verse 21, would be those in the territory of Jordan, because the beast is not going to conquer that territory. Going on in verse 21, flee to the mountains, let those who are in the midst of her depart out, and let not those who are in the country enter her. Now it's not clear here whether this refers to the city of Jerusalem or to the entire area of Judea, as it once was. We call it the state of Israel today. It is at this point in the Olivet prophecy of Matthew and Mark that they warn those on the rooftops of houses not to come down, or those who are outside in the field not to come back into the home. They need to flee immediately because there's no time to spare. Luke inserted that specific warning that Matthew and Mark would put here in the flow. He inserted that earlier, back in chapter 17, verse 31. So Luke's already addressed that in a different context. Now, although there will be a period of 30 days from the time that the beast's armies establish their presence around the perimeter of the city of Jerusalem and before they attack it, there is no indication that anyone will have time to leave or be allowed to leave, have freedom to leave once the armies are in place. So it will be necessary, according to this, don't come down from the top of your house, don't come in from the field. When you see this, whatever you're doing, drop everything and go. It means immediate action must be taken. Now, in conjunction with Jesus' command to flee from Judea, Mark's account includes Jesus' instruction to his disciples to pray that their flight not occur in the winter. Matthew goes even further and says, pray that your flight be neither in the winter nor on the Sabbath day. So each one is different. Luke doesn't bring it up at all. But again, Luke is depending on eyewitness testimony. And apparently that was one thing that his eyewitnesses didn't relay on to him, and so he didn't record it. But we've got Matthew and Mark telling us that. Verse 21, for these are the days of vengeance, or this is the time of punishment, the New International has. That all things, or when, Revised English Bible, when all things that are written may be fulfilled. This verse shows that the entire Olivet prophecy is directly connected to the fulfillment of the prophecy that outlines all that the Messiah was anointed to preach and proclaim. Back here in Isaiah chapter 61 that I mentioned earlier. In Isaiah chapter 61, verse 2, we read that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. This is the Messiah, the one who will be the Messiah. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. Now, at the synagogue in Nazareth, earlier in chapter 4 of Luke, Jesus stopped reading from the Torah, from the prophet Isaiah, at this particular point. At that scroll of Isaiah, he stopped right here and declared that everything that he had read had been fulfilled that day in their hearing. So, that had been fulfilled. Now we have something to add that he did not read that day, but which is included by the Olivet prophecy. He was anointed to preach and to proclaim the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. Now that goes on telling us what will happen when he comes at his second coming. But he did proclaim the day of vengeance. He mentions it. He tells us about it here in the Olivet prophecy. The days of vengeance summarize all of the events that are prophesied to end this age. Those days or those times include the time of tribulation that will come upon the Jews in the land of Israel today, as well as what comes on the remnant of the church that does not go into the place prepared by God. As well, it also refers to the time that the wrath of God will be poured out after the events of the fifth seal have been completed. We have a number of scriptures. I'll give you a couple. You can jot them down. Isaiah 63, verse 4, speaks of the day of vengeance, the year that God would redeem, that he would come to his redeemed. Hosea 9, verse 7, talks about the days of punishment and the days of retribution on Israel. Micah chapter 5, verse 15, God states that he will execute vengeance in anger and fury on all of the nations, all nations. Jeremiah 46:10, where he says that this is the day of the Lord God of hosts, a day of vengeance, that he may avenge himself on his adversaries. And it goes on talking about bringing retribution onto Babylon the Great, which again, Revelation chapter 18 goes into a lot of detail fulfilling that. Jeremiah 51:6, same thing. It's, again, flee from the midst of Babylon because Babylon will be destroyed. The time of the Lord's vengeance on Babylon. He will recompense her. Now, verse 22 here, Luke 21, serves as the preface to what is recorded in the accounts of Matthew and Mark about Jesus' warning of great tribulation that will be worse than any other time that has preceded it or will follow after it. Both of those talk about a time of great tribulation. Well, this vengeance, no doubt Jesus did state this as well. Matthew and Mark just quoted the great tribulation that's coming, but he prefaced it by this. So, going on in verse 23, but woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress in the land, and wrath, or judgment, some translations have, upon this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword. Notice, there will be great distress in the land of Israel. Now, we can look at this because people have wondered for ages, woe to those who are pregnant and nursing, whether they should get pregnant. That doesn't apply to any of us here, but that has been a concern. But all this would mean, if we took it in that way, which is not really the way it's meant, but any of Christ's female disciples in either of these conditions would have a much more difficult time due to the haste and the strenuous activities necessary in order to escape quickly. However, the main emphasis that's being made here is those in the land. Distress in the land is on the physical Jews who reside in Judea, or the land of Israel at the end time. It will be at that time that the beast will fulfill the prophecy of punishing those who live there for their hypocrisy that we covered earlier in Isaiah chapter 10. Now, the woe, because it says woe to those, the woe that will come on the women who are pregnant and nursing babies is explained by what was done to such, back here in Hosea chapter 13, when the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrians. When the Assyrians came in, they didn't treat the pregnant women and those who were nursing babies like some would think they would. Nope. Here in verse 16, breaking into verse 16, Hosea 13, they shall fall by the sword. Well, we just read that back in verse 24 of Luke 21. They will fall by the sword. Their infants shall be dashed in pieces, and their women with child ripped open. That's the reason for the woe. That's what's going to happen according to the Scripture. Going on in Luke 21, verse 24, they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led away captive into all nations. So we read here about a forced exile. This forced exile is prophesied only on the Jews living in the land of Israel at the close of the age. It is not about people living in North America or anywhere else. It's talking about those who will be living in that land where the beast's armies go in and take over. Zechariah chapter 14, let's note. Zechariah 14, verse 1. The New Revised Standard translates, "See, a day is coming," or "Behold, day is coming," other translations, "for the Lord, when the plunder taken from you will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city shall be taken, and the houses looted, and the women raped. Half the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city." So half, whatever doesn't die, the half of what doesn't die will be sold as slaves, go into exile, and the half that remain will simply be taken as slaves and used by the beast, his army, and whoever else is there. Because Joel, back to Joel, chapter 3, verse 1, here's the prophecy, "For behold, in those days, and at that time, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem," the exiles, and when he brought them back to the land of Israel and established them in the land so that there's a state of Israel today. Yes, that was a fulfillment of this prophecy. There are people who have said, "Oh, that had nothing." Yes, it does. God brought them back. They were scattered, they were kicked out by the Romans, and they were brought back. So it's a fulfillment of that prophecy. And he says, "I will also gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. And I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations." So they'll be brought back, but many of them are going to be scattered again when the beast comes in, just as we saw in Zechariah 14:2. "They have also divided up my land. They have cast lots for my people, have given a boy as payment for a harlot, and sold a girl for wine that they may drink." Skipping to verse 6, "Also the people of Judah and the people of Jerusalem you have sold to the Greeks, that you may remove them far from their borders." They've been sold to others. So, again, back to chapter 21 of Luke. Verse 24, "And be led away captive into all nations." This is prophesied. "And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles," or by the nations, "until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Now, the times of the Gentiles refer specifically to the length of time that the beast will control Jerusalem before he leaves the city to fight against all of the armies that invade from the north that we read about in Daniel chapter 11, verse 44. It says he leaves the city, he goes because he hears the reports out of the north. In Revelation chapter 11, verse 2, times of the Gentiles defined for us here. Daniel 11, verse 2, John is told in this vision, "But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it. For it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months, which is equal to, in prophetic terminology, to 1,260 days, or 3.5 times. Back in Luke 21, verse 25, New American Standard translates, "And there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and upon the earth dismay among nations," or distress of nations, New King James has, "in perplexity," or bewildered, as some translations have, at the roaring of the sea and the waves," or the Revised English Bible has, "they will be bewildered at the roar and surge of the sea." Now, this verse is referring to the events associated with the sixth seal. We're told of a great earthquake causing widespread tsunamis. That's what this roar and surge of the sea is here. This is tsunamis. We also find out that in those heavenly signs, the light of the sun will be completely blackened. The moon's light will be highly filtered. Either a great meteor shower or stars appearing to fall due to the violence of the earthquake that shakes the earth. And finally, the sky devoid of any light whatsoever. That's the heavenly signs. It will get everybody's attention. Note here in Revelation 6. Revelation 6, verse 12. John writes, I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth, and the moon became like blood, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree drops its late figs when it is shaken by a mighty wind. Then the sky receded as a scroll when it's rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. Isaiah emphasizes the magnitude of this earthquake back in Isaiah chapter 24. Because in Isaiah 24, verse 18 here, breaking into verse 18, it says that the foundations of the earth are shaken. The earth is violently broken. The earth is split open. The earth is shaken exceedingly. Notice how many times he's talking about this. This is going to be unbelievable. It says, the earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard. That means it will wobble on its axis in order for these things to happen. So this is going to be something to gain the attention of the whole world. When God puts an end to the frivolity of the Antichrist, who comes to Jerusalem and is allowed to rule for about 2.5 years. Back in chapter 21 of Luke, verse 26, the New Living Translation has, people will be terrified at what they see coming upon the earth. For the powers in the heavens, or the powers of heaven, will be shaken. So people will seek underground shelters in hope of surviving the outpouring of God's wrath. That's what this is talking about. Going on in Revelation chapter 6, verse 15, Revelation 6:15, and the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? So that's why we read about people being petrified and terrified back here in chapter 21, verse 26. It will be at this time that the opening of the seventh seal will occur, immediately after the sixth, followed by the beginning of the calamities associated with the seven trumpets. Now, Jesus, in every account of the Olivet prophecy, whether Luke here, whether Matthew or Mark, Jesus chose to skip over and not go into details concerning the first six trumpets. He waited and let John do that, decades later. He gave him all of that instruction of the precise events that would take place. But he doesn't here. He just skips over that. We go to verse 27 then. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, throughout his ministry, Jesus referred to himself time and time again as the Son of Man, a designation that the Jews living at that time simply did not associate with the prophecies concerning the Messiah. It was apparently for that reason that Jesus chose to use this title, the Son of Man. By doing that, he would avoid a direct claim that he was the Messiah too early. Couldn't do it too early because there would be people massing to make him king and to get busy with throwing the Romans out of out of Judea. So, on a few occasions, he did infer that he, the Son of Man, had divine connections. Note, in John chapter 5. John 5, verse 26. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself, and has given him authority to execute judgment also, because he is the Son of Man. Chapter 6 and verse 62. What then, Jesus says, if you should see the Son of Man ascend where he was before? The people who heard these things simply did not understand that they were connected to the Messiah. For him to ascend to where he was before, well, where was he before? They could not comprehend. To them, the Messiah was to be a man who would deliver Israel and raise up a kingdom and rule it forever. That's what we find them saying here in John chapter 12, verse 34. The people answered him, "We have heard from the law that the Christ, the Messiah, remains forever." That's what they're expecting, a man to come and he would remain forever. And how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? Again, they could not understand that he was talking about himself. Now, here in Luke 21:27, Jesus refers to the one passage in the Holy Scriptures that directly references the title Son of Man. And that's here in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. Daniel 7:13, where Daniel writes, "I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed." Now, this sounds exactly like what they were expecting the Messiah. One like the Son of Man. To him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom that all nations should serve him. That's what the Messiah was to do. Why couldn't they connect it? God kept them blinded. They couldn't see it. But that's exactly what he was. The Son of Man is directly identified here as Messiah. Now, in response to the question his disciples had asked him regarding the sign when the toppling of every stone of the temple complex would finally be concluded. You know, that was back up in verses 6 and 7. They were looking for the sign because that's what they were interested in. When are all these things going to be destroyed? When are all the stones going to fall like you say? When will that be? And of course, Matthew connected that to Jesus' coming rather than what Luke does up here in verses 6 and 7. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, it's the sign of Jesus' coming, which is different, but the same. And so Jesus declares that he, as the Son of Man, prophesied by Daniel, would come in the glory of clouds after having received the dominion of the earth from the Father. His coming will occur when humanity will be in absolute misery after having experienced the calamities announced by the first 6 trumpets. It will also be at his coming that the prophecy concerning the whole tribe of Judah finally acknowledging him as the Savior and mourning for their past refusal to do so will be fulfilled, which is recorded back in Zechariah chapter 12. They will finally admit that he indeed was the one. Now, back to chapter 21, verse 28. Now, when these things begin to happen, look up, or as Lamsa has, have courage. When these things begin to happen, have courage and lift up your heads, because your redemption, or your salvation, Lamsa has, draws near. So what Jesus is saying here is, unlike the rest of humanity, who will be terrified by all of the cataclysmic events of God's wrath that will be taking place on the earth during the days of vengeance, which these are, verse 26, the disciples of Christ should be excitedly anticipating what they will soon experience. They will soon be changed into immortal children of God possessing eternal life. Don't be terrified by these things, Jesus says. This shows that it's almost, finally, it's almost here. Verse 29, and he spoke to them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they are already budding, or when they sprout leaves, you see and know for yourselves, or you know, Goodspeed has, without being told, that summer is now near. As we know, God designed life on this planet to undergo seasons. Both lengths of daylight hours and variations in the mean temperatures throughout the seasons determine when sap flows and when buds swell and we have blooms and fruit and so on. These are the signs that winter is over and that spring has arrived. In using the example of the fig tree and all the other trees, now Matthew doesn't use all the other trees, it just uses the fig tree, but here Luke uses the fig tree and all other trees. He emphasizes that in nature there are undeniable signs that the season is changing. So, verse 31, so you likewise, or you in the same way, when you see these things happening, know that the kingdom of God is near. Just as surely as the signs in nature indicate the arrival of a new season, so it will be that when all of the signs that he has enumerated have taken place, the time appointed by God the Father for the beginning of the series of prophetic events that will culminate in the end of the age will be reached. Verse 32, assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till, or before, some translations say, will pass away before all things are fulfilled. The term, this generation, refers principally to the group of the elect who witness the signs that Jesus has given, all the way back here from the beginning of sorrows until God's appointed time arrives. It can also refer to those of humanity who lived during the time when mankind first achieved the ability to completely destroy life off of this planet. The length of a generation is, again, not always the same. It's regarded in the Bible as sometimes 20 years. We go back to those who were 20 years and under, as far as the division of those who went into the promised land, those who didn't. We have 40 years. We have 70 years. We have 100 years. So we've got generations identified various ways. Now, to which of those spans of time is Jesus referring here? This generation. It must be the generation living during the time when man becomes capable of destroying all life, and when what Matthew records, but Luke leaves out directly, he infers, but he doesn't bring it out directly, when Matthew tells us about conditions within the body of Christ, the offenses, the hatred, the betrayals that take place toward the close of the age. When all of these things happen, due to the love of many growing coals, what it says in Matthew 24:10, mankind has had the ability to erase all life with nuclear weapons since sometime in the early 70s. When you look at the stockpiles that the U.S. and USSR had at that point in time. Now, supposedly they've downgraded some of those. No, they've made more powerful weapons, so they still have the ability to do it. And we know chemical and bacterial, there are a number of ways it can be done. We've seen enough various movies with different plots and scenarios and 24 to know. We know that it can be done other ways. So again, going back to the early 70s, based on our experience, the beginning of the decadent spiritual state prophesied to affect many of Christ's disciples at the close of the age can be traced back to the late 80s, early 90s, because that's when everything really hit the fan very clearly. Since we have gone beyond 20 years, it's obvious it's got to be 40. If it's 70, may we all die early, because we don't want to experience what goes past this 40. I don't believe. As bad as it's getting, as quickly as it's intensifying. So, we'll see. Somewhere it's got to be in the 40 slot, because we're almost 30 years. We're probably are 30 years since things began to go haywire. All right, verse 33. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Jesus now stresses that what he has revealed is absolute. Nothing will be able to alter any of the signs or the events that he has recorded here, or that he is inspired to be recorded. In doing so, he reminds his disciples of the temporal state of this physical universe. God reveals this truth numerous times throughout his word. Through David back in Psalm 102, through Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 51, through Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3. All three of them record for us the fact that everything's going to disappear that's physical. It's all going to revert back to the spirit from which it was composed. So, yes, heaven and earth will pass away, no question about it, at least in the physical realm. There is obviously an earth in the spirit realm, because otherwise, what's New Jerusalem coming down to? It's coming down to an earth without seas. It's a different earth, but it's in the realm of spirit. Now, at this point in the recorded testimonies of the Olivet prophecy, although it was included in the accounts of both Matthew and Mark, Luke omits Jesus' declaration that no one except God the Father knows the exact day and hour when the key event will occur that will begin the 1,335-day countdown to the return of Jesus Christ. Luke omits it. Doesn't mention it in chapter 17 either. But again, he depends. None of this he saw himself. What he records is what he received from his witnesses, those who came to him, eyewitnesses, he tells us at the very intro of this book. Now, it's also at this point that Matthew compares the similarities of the conditions during the days of Noah to the conditions at the time of the end, and how the flood of Noah caught the whole world completely off guard, just as the key event that leads up to Christ's return will occur unexpectedly, like a thief in the night. Luke inserted that part of the prophecy back in chapter 17. We've already covered that. But he did record it, he just didn't put it here. Verse 34 now of Luke 21. But take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing. Moffat has, lest your hearts be overpowered by. Revised English Bible, lest your minds be dulled by. And instead of carousing, Goodspeed has self-indulgence, because that's what carousing is. Self-indulgence. So, beware, take heed to yourselves, lest your minds be dulled by self-indulgence, drunkenness, and cares of this life, and that day come on you unexpectedly. For it will come as a snare, like a trap sprung, on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Now, this exhortation seems to be derived from two separate passages in Matthew's account of the Olivet prophecy. First of all, Matthew gave us Jesus' warning that the love of many of Christ's disciples would grow cold due to the rampant growth of lawlessness in the world. And secondly, he gave a warning that the day when the countdown begins, that ends with his return, will be completely unexpected. And that's what verses 34 and 35 seem to entail, seems to be derived from that. Now, the Apostle Peter later reiterated the essence of this warning in verses 34 and 35, actually from verse 33 through verse 35. So let's go back, 2 Peter chapter 3, and see what we have here, because he takes into account heaven and earth passing away here, just as we have recorded in Luke 21:33. Okay, verse 10, 2 Peter 3, verse 10. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Okay, heaven and earth will pass away. Now, verse 11 from the Complete Jewish Bible. Since everything is going to be destroyed like this, what kind of people should you be? You should lead holy and godly lives. Now, verse 12 is not translated well in almost any translation I can find other than Lamsa. Lamsa has, and I think there's one other, but I don't remember which one. But anyway, Lamsa has here, you should lead holy and godly lives, looking for and longing for the coming of the day of God. Because you cannot, as it is in most translations, you cannot work to hasten the day. The time has been set. Nothing can change. Nothing can alter. So that is not accurate. But looking for and longing for the coming of the day of the Lord, that we can. That day will bring on the destruction of the heavens by fire, and the elements will melt with the heat, or from the heat. Going on in verse 13, the New King James, nevertheless, regardless of what's coming down the pike eventually, nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Therefore, beloved, looking forward to these things, be diligent to be found by him in peace, without spot and blameless. In other words, don't, as it says back up here in chapter 21, verse 34, don't let your minds be overpowered by self-indulgence. Now, skipping down to verse 17 of 2 Peter 3, you therefore, beloved, since you know this beforehand, you've been aware, you're made aware of it. Jesus warned you about it. Beware lest you also fall from your own steadfastness, being led away with the error of the wicked. And so, to me, that fits perfectly with what we have back here in Luke 21, verses 33 through 35. Now, verse 36. Watch, therefore, and pray always, that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. In the context of this passage with the previous two verses, the primary point of the command to watch is on being spiritually introspective, looking inside, staying spiritually alert, so that the wickedness of this world does not distract us from staying focused on the coming of the kingdom of God. In order to succeed in doing this, it's critical to continually stay close to God in prayer. So what he says, watch, therefore, pray always. Can't let up on that. Must stay close to God to stay spiritually alert. Jesus also reveals to the elect that they need to include in their prayers their desire to be among those who are privileged to escape the horrors of the coming tribulation that comes on this world by going into the place of refuge that God has prepared for his elect. As he says in Revelation chapter 3, verse 10. You know, he will. He will. For those who have done what they're supposed to do, they will be given the opportunity to be protected through that hour of trial that comes on all the earth. As well as Revelation 12:14, where God has the place prepared for the woman, where she goes and flees. And then, of course, not only to be part of that group, but also to be part in the first resurrection, when they will finally, at the first resurrection, they'll be changed, made spirit, and will finally see Christ as he is, in the realm of spirit, in his glorified state. That's what it means to stand before the Son of Man. Now, Luke omits the final part of the Olivet prophecy that's contained only in Matthew's account. Not even Mark goes on and gives more information, which would be the parable of the 10 virgins, the parable of the talents, and then details that he goes through concerning the final 2 days of judgment for salvation that follows his return. Later, that Sunday evening, remember he left after chastising or giving his chastisement of the scribes and Pharisees. He and his disciples left. They brought up the point about the temple complex. They went out, 4 of them there on the Mount of Olives, began to speak with him and ask him specifically about the signs. So that was late Sunday afternoon. So later that evening, according to the accounts of Matthew and Mark, there was a woman at the house of Simon the leper that poured some expensive perfumed oil on Jesus' head during the supper that was held there. It was either later that night or sometime on Monday that Judas went to the chief priests and promised to deliver Jesus to them for 30 pieces of silver. Because remember, Jesus had corrected Judas. Judas was the only one that mouthed off at the time that Mary put the expensive perfume on his feet. Now we have it happen again, but it says disciples, plural. So Judas and somebody else said something apparently, and so Judas got corrected twice, and that was enough. That pushed him over, and so he does this for 30 pieces of silver. Now, verse 37, and in the daytime he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and stayed on the mountain called Olivet. Then, early in the morning, all of the people came to him in the temple, or the temple courts, to hear him. Now, verses 37 and 38 are a summary of what Jesus had done from the time he had arrived there on Friday, Sabbath, and Sunday. For 3 days. This summarizes the 3 days of his public teaching, because his public teaching ended on Sunday afternoon when he warned everyone about the scribes and the Pharisees and the fact that they were not to be followed as far as their hypocritical ways of doing things. So that brings us to the close of chapter 21, and we'll get into chapter 22 next time.